Hello and welcome to part 2 of week 1 of INFOST 440. So in the second video, we're going to be going over a brief history of the internet networks. I'm going to show you essentially at a high level how servers work, and then review how the student web space works, which most of you should have used before in your INFOST 240 course. So history of the internet. I'm sure many of you have memories of these AOL CDs that used to come in the mail, what seems like to be every week back in the 90s. This is sort of the epitome of how the internet grew to be what it is today. It's everybody dialing in using AOL. What did I have? When I was growing up, I had Prodigy, and then it got bought out by like a SBC or something similar, Global, and then AT&T. But yeah, this is, really how the internet came to be mainstream, was with AOL and other companies offering dial-up internet services. Come on, PowerPoint. But really, the internet for others that weren't, consumers, started really kind of off in the late 50s through the 70s. Essentially the bare bones of technology and infrastructure were designed and invented, and people started figuring out, hey, we have these kind of bare bones computers. Wouldn't it be great if we could connect them together? And then, hey, wouldn't it be great if we could connect these together over longer distances and then connect them together with other organizations? So that rudimentary idea of being able to connect computers together over distances sort of grew, and eventually the first internet was formed. This didn't happen until 1974 was when the term internet was coined, when essentially you have all these different networks connected together. Still, again, mostly used by like research universities and for commercial purposes. Not really used at home until the 90s, as you know. Kind of as a side note, one show I'd recommend if you're interested kind of in like the history of the internet, this is a fiction show, but it's called *Halt and Catch Fire*. I'd recommend checking it out if you're kind of like a nerd about the early days of computing and the internet. It's kind of a cool show. But yeah, the internet came around to be in full force in the 90s. As you know, when everybody started getting those AOL coasters in the mail, I used to use it to put my drinks on the wood table. Sometimes my parents would yell at me, so I'd grab a coaster from the mailbox, and I'd use it for that. Obviously, internet grew pretty fast. Mid-90s, 96, 97, and by 2000, there was 80 million users. I got my first computer in probably was like 1998, and we had internet dial-up service. And my parents very quickly realized that we needed to have a second phone line, since and my siblings pretty much addicted to using the family computer to go online and use AOL Instant Messenger and IRC for chatting with friends and all those other fun services. Obviously today, pretty much everybody has at least one internet connected device, even like in very rural areas. So as an example, I was just in Nepal about like a month and a half ago, and in the mountains, there's no power. There's not any physical internet access, but everybody has a cell phone that's internet connected, which is kind of crazy to think that there's no power, but people are still connected to the internet through their smartphones and their flip phones. So pretty much everybody on this planet seems like everybody has some sort of internet connected device. Even if it's not a fully fledged computer, they have some sort of device that connects them with the world, which is pretty remarkable. So now there's billions of people connected. So there's different parts of the internet that allow it to work. Again, this week we're only going to go over it at a very high level. Next week we'll dive a little bit deeper. But essentially the internet is made up of all these different parts of infrastructure, and it runs at sort of a software level using a wide array of different protocols. So here are some different protocols you might potentially see. I often refer to this part as kind of alphabet soup. You're going to see a lot of different protocols used in this class, as I'm sure you've seen used in other classes, and you might not necessarily know what they mean. So part of being a good IT person is being able to use Google very well and Googling things that you're not quite sure what they mean to figure out if they're important or if you need to worry about them. So here are some important acronyms or protocols or alphabet soups you have to know for web application development and general internet use. So HTTP. I'm guessing pretty much everybody has heard of HTTP. Stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. Then there's other things like FTP, HTTPS, Telnet, Email, Usenet, SSH, and SFTP, who is. and there's much more. So again, when you come across some of these acronyms, you're not quite sure what they mean or whether or not they're useful. If you're doing some research, if you're trying to learn something new, just Google them. You can Google, like, as an example, like, what is Usenet? And you're going to find a ton of information explaining what it is, how it's used, and you can make the determination whether or not it's important to you in the context that you are looking for it with. HTTP versus HTTPS. Again, this is probably most of you already know this, but HTTPS is essentially a secured version of HTTP. S stands for secured. When you're using HTTPS, most modern web browsers will have a little lock icon next to the URL or address. And actually, a lot of web browsers now are starting to display alerts if you're on just an HTTP page, just so you know that the site is not secured, it's not encrypted. Traditionally, the only sites that would use HTTPS would be things that were passing around sensitive information, like on an e-commerce site, or when you're filling out your FAFSA, or on a banking site. Traditionally, that's where HTTPS was used, but now it's used pretty much everywhere in every scenario. Even if you're just doing something goofy, like, I don't know, playing an online game, you're still going to be using HTTPS nowadays. The reason why HTTPS was more limited in the past is the way that this works is there's certificates that are installed on the server and then are essentially issued by what's called a certificate authority. These certificate authorities used to essentially charge a ton of money for these certificates that needed to get loaded onto the server that were signed by them. The pricing for that has come down substantially, and you can even get essentially vetted certificates at no cost. So it's a lot more accessible. So people have realized, we might as well just run HTTPS over everything. So there's not really any downside, but the benefits are that people are going to have a greater level of privacy and have more security. So most sites nowadays will be HTTPS 100%. If you see something with HTTP, just be aware that if someone else is on the network, like let's say you're in a coffee shop browsing around online, if you're on an HTTP site, the guy next to you could probably snoop in and see exactly what you're doing by using certain software tools to sniff network traffic. In this class, you're going to be using FTP or SFTP to upload and download files. So you'll use FileZilla primarily, or at least that's what I'm going to use. But you can use whatever you want. There are many different types of FTP clients that'll use this FTP or file transfer protocol. SSH is used to manage a web server and other types of Linux servers. I use this pretty much every day in my job as a systems administrator, and essentially provides a secure command line interface to our servers. Whois? So when you register a domain on the internet like uwmsoas.com, you can actually go through and see who owns it, or anybody can go and see who owns it. Whenever a domain is registered, there's essentially an address book of contact information. Why can't I control click? There it goes. And so if I type in uwm.edu, it's probably going to tell me to go to EduCause because it's registered through EduCause. We'll see if this works. You can use the Whois database to find out who's responsible for a domain. And there are different Whois services. If you want to look up .edu domains, you have to use the EduCause site. For whatever reason, it's not working right now. I'll try one last time before we move on. But you can see who's responsible for it, which is what Whois allows you to do. Yeah, it's not going to work. Oh, well. Ping is used for troubleshooting a lot of the time. You can send essentially a little boop, kind of like a radar. Ping. And essentially, if a server is online, a lot of times they'll respond back using this tool. IRC, Internet Relay Chat. This was before AIM, MSN, or Facebook Messenger. It's still popular among developers. This is my first chatting client that I use. This is how I learned a lot about technology, by going and chatting with a lot of probably shady people in the mid-90s about how websites are built and how things operate in terms of infrastructure and stuff like that. It's really the first chatting service that existed. So those are just some of the protocols that you might encounter. And again, there are many more. And if you're curious and you want to learn more about any of the ones that I discussed or any you might encounter in the future, just Google around. Really, that's the best way to learn and figure it out. You're not going to remember what every acronym stands for. Like if you ask me, like, what does MAC address stand for? I know what a MAC address is, but I wouldn't know specifically what MAC standed for. You could Google. So again, Googling is going to be your friend to figure out things that you don't quite understand. A URL, this is going to be another important one that I'll talk about in a little bit more in depth. Obviously, you've heard the term URL, but I wanted to go over what the different components of a URL are. This is going to be important to understand in terms of being able to program PHP scripts that'll be living in different files and folders. So you probably already went over this in 240, but the first part of a URL is the domain name. So this is going to be, your mysite.com, udvm.edu. It's going to be that name that everybody recognizes that they go to as sort of the homepage of your site. Part of that domain name is essentially built out of what's called a TLD, the top level domain. That's going to be the .com, the .net, the .edu. That is the domain part of your domain name. The part of the front is going to specify the protocol that's being used. So HTTP or HTTPS. Then you have the file and folder path. Together, those are known as the path. So you might have different folders, and within a subfolder or another folder, you might have then finally the file you want to load, such as pictures.html. This full thing all together is known as a URL, which is a Uniform Resource Locator. Isn't that a fun name? So I'm just going to quickly highlight some design aspects. So as you'll see throughout this semester, I am definitely not an expert of good design. If you want to learn how to design really pretty, nice looking web pages, I'd recommend taking Rebecca Hall's e-publishing and web design. It's a graduate level class. I believe it's INFOST 685. In this class, I'm going to teach you how to build web applications, but they're not going to look that great. With that being said, I do appreciate good design, and I definitely want your applications to be usable. So let me show you some examples of what I would consider to be good design and some examples of what I consider to be bad design. So what is good design? Design appeal varies, it changes, it's difficult to teach. Good design tends to stand out in a good way, it's noticeable. It makes sites easy to navigate and retrieve information. What is an example of good design? Well, I'd say the SOAS website. udemy.edu/SOAS. Well, here we can just go right here and this redirect us to the SOAS Tech site. So again, here's the SOAS Tech website. It's easy to find information on the student web space and other services we offer. I think this is a good design. You could also look at big sites like Amazon or Facebook or Twitter. Those companies spend a lot of money making sure that they have good design. So then what is bad design? Well, here's some examples of some sites that are poorly designed. Let's take a look at Hyperbubble. We'll see if this one is still up. This one actually used to be a lot worse, and these links I have, I see this every semester, are kind of outdated. Here we go. This is a bad design site. A really bright background, difficult to read small text, busy sites, things that are difficult to read or use. That's what bad design is. For your assignments in this class, I'm really just looking for your applications to be usable. If you can make them look nice, that's awesome, and I really appreciate that, but they just need to be usable. So generally, you won't lose points unless your application isn't very usable. So as an example, one semester I had someone turn in one of their assignments. They had a red background with red text. And I gave them like a 0. I'm like, well, there's nothing here. Your assignment doesn't work. There's no interface to it, right? They're like, yes, it is. You just have to highlight the text. I'm like, that is terrible. Why would you make the text in the background the same color, right? So that would be bad design. Make sure that it is usable and I can actually use your assignment. Another semester, someone had used JavaScript and they went crazy with all these different pop-ups that would go and randomly pop up around a page, and I couldn't grade their assignment. I couldn't actually get the assignment to work because the pop-ups kept coming up before I could click on any of the links or any of the buttons. So that person also lost points because I couldn't use their assignment. And also, this is more of a personal thing too. I always hate like the bright red background with black text. That just hurts my eyes for whatever reason. So please don't do that either. So your assignments don't need to look like the nicest thing in the world. You can model them after my examples, which are essentially the bare minimum of design. But just make sure they are usable. Again, if you can make them nice and make them be beautiful, that's awesome. But at the very least, make sure they are usable and they won't drive me nuts. One thing I'm going to recommend is when you build your web application, I would definitely recommend testing it in a couple of web browsers. I primarily use Google Chrome, so you want to make sure you test your assignments at least in Chrome, so that way you know when I'm grading and it's going to load correctly. But generally test it in at least one or two of the browsers to make sure it's loaded or it looks consistently across different web browsers. On SOS Lab computers, we have Internet Explorer, Chrome, and Firefox installed. Those are the three that I recommend testing most of your web applications with. As you probably have realized, certain sites work better in some browsers or others. So you might build the web application and be like, this is awesome, it works and looks great, and you're used to using some obscure browser, but you load it up in a different browser and it looks terrible. So again, make sure you test your applications in different browsers, specifically Google Chrome, because that's what I'm going to be using to grade your assignments. Again, I'm already expecting you to know HTML, so I'm not going to touch on it too much. Make sure that you know how to do all these basic things, particularly create tables and work with forms. That's going to be important. It is also going to be important you know how to use CSS to make cascading style sheets and add some decent style to your sites. Again, they don't need to be super beautiful, but they need to be functional. JavaScript for this class isn't super important. If you know JavaScript and you can use it without driving me nuts with different types of pop-ups, then definitely feel free to use it. That being said, JavaScript is not necessarily required for this class, but it will be handy if you have some JavaScript experience. As you're going to learn, the web applications you're going to develop are essentially going to have a smattering of languages all combined into one. So as an example, some of the applications you're going to make in future weeks are going to have HTML, PHP, CSS, JavaScript potentially, and MySQL all intertwined within one another. A good way to brush up and learn, especially for things like HTML, is just to look at source code of different websites. You can go into a website, Control U, look at the source code, and it helps you reverse engineer it. For things like PHP and, as you're going to learn next week, server-side scripting languages, a good way to learn and sort of test yourself with that type of knowledge is to go through and download open source applications like WordPress, Drupal, etc., and take a peek at the source code from there. A lot of these techniques will help you learn and explore the possibilities. I first learned HTML and PHP. I was probably like 10 or 11 years old. It was probably like the late 90s, if I remember correctly. PHP was still relatively new, and there wasn't a ton of information online about it. So I downloaded a couple open source applications, and I was reverse engineering it. I was looking at this source code, tinkering with it, playing with it, trying to break it, figuring out how it worked, and that's how I learned how to build web applications when I was much younger. So again, you can use the same techniques to go through and learn to program yourself, but obviously it's usually not as nice as going through a class like this. So if you have any questions and you get stuck somewhere, don't hesitate to reach out to me. If you're unsure whether or not you have the HTML skills and programming skills you're going to need for this class, let me know. Like maybe if you're concerned, if you took 240 a long time ago and you're not sure of the skills, you can have a conversation with me. I can kind of assess where you are and how much catching up you're going to have to do before we really get started in the next couple of weeks. This week and next week is going to be pretty light. You're not going to be doing anything too crazy. But starting with week 3 and 4, it's going to get more difficult. So just keep in mind, you essentially have 2 weeks to catch back up and refresh and relearn any HTML or CSS that you need to sort of refresh yourself with. And then we're going to dive sort of headfirst into PHP, really starting in week 3. Next week, we will work with some PHP code, but it's still going to be a pretty light workload in comparison to what's to come. So now moving on, we're going to talk about setting up your web space. I'm hopeful everybody has used the SOA student web space for the INFOST 240 class. If you took INFOST 240 years ago, you might have used Pantherfile or another technology. but we've been using the web space for all of our web classes for a long while now. It's important to know that this web space is essentially just a sandbox environment that's only used for development work. Please do not put a portfolio website on the web space because it will be deleted when you graduate or if your site is compromised. If your site's compromised or hacked, we will remove your account and your content will go away. So that also means that it's important to back up your work. We do not take backups of the server. It's your responsibility to make sure your work is backed up. Occasionally, if your account is hacked or something happens to the server, we will rebuild it and ask that you restore the backup that you took. If you didn't take a backup, nothing is going to be restored. We generally will clear off the server at least once a semester or when you graduate, so just be mindful of that your stuff does get cleared off from time to time. So with that in mind, let's get started. So if you don't already have an account, you can navigate to uwmsoas.com and click on the register link. By default, when you click on uwmsoas.com, it's going to take you to a page with some instructions on how to access the service. So the register button is right around, I should just make that button more noticeable. I always have trouble finding it myself. Here. You're going to ask you to use your ePath ID and password in this one login page. And then if you already have an account, it's going to tell you that. If your account is suspended, because we suspend accounts between different terms, it's going to unsuspend it and tell you that it did that. Or if you don't yet have an account, it'll allow you to create one. So when you create an account, you have to essentially set a different password because the password system is not linked between our web space server and the rest of the ePanther systems. So you have to set a new password. There are some password requirements, and we ask that you don't use the same password as your ePanther ID for security reasons. So make sure you set a different password that you're not using anywhere else, including at UWM. After you make an account, you'll be able to log in using cPanel or via HTTP. You can upload things via FTP. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because you should have done this in 240. If you register for an account and you can access your site and it looks like this, that's good news. It means that it's working. That means you probably don't have anything on your site yet. Via cPanel, you can do things like upload and download files, create databases, talk with Ben, talk with your instructor. Ben was one of my TAs a few semesters ago. But cPanel essentially allows you to manage your web space. cPanel will look something like this. So again, I take it you're all pretty much familiar with your cPanel accounts. Some of the tools we're going to use in cPanel later on that I want to make special note of will be the databases category and PHPMyAdmin. I would not recommend cPanel for uploading, downloading files, or editing files. I'd recommend that you do them on your computer or edit them on your computer and upload them using a tool like FileZilla. You can use cPanel as you want. There's a file manager in cPanel, but use it at your own risk. I'd recommend, again, using FileZilla, which uses FTP. Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I know you've done this for INFOST 240. I'll go over permissions a little bit later on, but it's going to be important that your PHP files have permissions of 644 in the the folders of 755. We'll talk about that later on. Again, it's going to be important that you take backups. There are a number of ways you can take backups. First way is by using FileZilla and downloading them locally from the server onto your computer, dragging and dropping them over. Drag, drop, drag, drop. You can also use the cPanel backup tool. So under cPanel, there's a backup category that allows you to download your home directory or individual databases. Again, I'm not going to go over this too much. You should have went over this in INFOST 240. How often should you take backups and which tools should you use? Well, it really depends. I tend to take backups using the built-in backup tool in cPanel. I generally tend to take backups once a week or whenever I make significant changes to my account. So in general, I think probably for this class, you're going to want to take backups probably once a week, probably right after you're done with your assignment, just in case something happens with your account before I'm able to grade it. Generally, we back up our servers every day at SOAS. In some cases, we back up our servers every hour. We keep our backups for a couple of months, and our backups are automated. But keep in mind, generally, the student web space is not backed up by SOAS, and it is your responsibility to make sure you have your work backed up in case there are any issues with your account. Again, I'd recommend using Notepad++ or any desktop-based text editor. You can use a cPanel online text editor, but again, probably not my first choice. Index pages. So I'm going to go over index pages. They're an important concept that people usually seem to get kind of messed up with. So index pages are essentially the home page that you can set for each individual folder on your account. So for whatever reason, people seem to always mess this up. So I'm going to show you a couple of examples how index pages work. So I have my web space. Let me go into it. And here is my account. I'm going to make a new folder called Week 1 using FileZilla. And again, as a refresher, I will show you how to connect to your web space. Host will be uwmsoas.com, your ePanther ID, and password you have set for your account. You need to make your folders inside of public HTML, otherwise it will not show up on the web space. I'm going to make a Week 1 folder. So in this class, it is really important to make all your folder and file names lowercase without spaces or other special characters. The server is case sensitive. So you'll notice that the folder name here is Week 1 without any spaces or any uppercase characters. That's important because if the casing is different, it's not going to work. So again, make sure that your folder and file names are all lowercase without spaces. So now I'm going to use Notepad++ to create a quick HTML file that we're going to use. Okay. It's just going to be called test. I'll save that to the desktop. We're going to call it first test.html. And now I'm going to upload it from my desktop into the Week 1 folder that I had just created. Come on, where is my file? And if I click on it, it loads just fine. So, first lesson is index files. If I rename any PHP or HTML file to index, by default now when I refresh this page, it's going to load instead of that index of directory listing. So when I ask you to make an index page, I'm asking for you to make the home page of your site set up so that way your assignment loads. So if I click on Week 1, this test file already loads. The file name is currently index. But if I rename this to index.html, but with a capital I instead of a lowercase I, it doesn't work anymore. It does not load by default. So in this example, you would lose points. But again, as soon as I switch it back to index.html, it's going to load automatically. Ta-da! So just keep that in mind. Because you will definitely lose points on your assignment if you do not use index.html or index.php with a lowercase I. Same thing with folder and file names. So again, the reason why we have everything lowercase without spaces, if this is called Week 1 with a capital W and a space, it looks fine when I click on it from here, this index of, you'll notice that the URL becomes kind of messy. Where there's a space, there's this %20, right? So that's really goofy. So if you wanted to tell someone, hey, look up my site at shoal253.edu/week1, you have to say week 1 with a capital W and %20. It makes your URL really goofy looking. And if someone actually does a lowercase w instead of a capital W, you're going to get an error message. So please make sure that all of your file and folder names are all lowercase without spaces or special characters. It'll make everybody's life a lot easier. So going back to the presentation. So good, I talked about index pages. Great. So for this week, your assignment essentially comprises of registering for the web space if you're not already registered, and submitting the link to the Dropbox. In addition, we also have a participation where you need to introduce yourself to the class. Your assignment's going to be due on the coming Sunday by 11:59 p.m. If you want, you can buy or find the textbook online, and you can review any HTML or CSS type things if you feel like you might need a refresher. Next week, we're going to continue reviewing some brief HTML, and then we're going to start with PHP, which should be exciting and awesome. So let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy this course and everybody has a good first week of the semester.